All right, so Project 2025, huh? Seems like everyone's got an opinion on this one. Articles everywhere you look. And yeah, we get it. Public education, that's a pretty big deal. We're going to try to cut through some of the noise here and help you figure out what really matters.
Absolutely. It's a big one. We're talking about potentially changing the entire structure of education, how it's funded, how it's run, even what's actually being taught in the classroom. We'll unpack all of that and try to figure out what it all means for you.
Okay, so get this. No more Department of Education, like completely gone. That's just one of the things that Project 2025 is proposing. We're talking about taking power away from the federal government and giving it back to individual states.
And that's really just the beginning. It's like someone took all of these ideas about education reform, like school choice and curriculum reform, and just turned it up to 1,000,000. This is big and ambitious, and honestly, a lot of people think it's pretty controversial.
So this isn't just like a little change, right? This is like a total reshaping of how we think about education in this country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to really understand what the impact could be, we have to look at it historically. This whole debate about who controls education, the federal government or the states, that's been going on for decades.
Like back in the 60s with desegregation, that was the federal government stepping in, right? States weren't exactly lining up to do that on their own.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of the federal government stepping in to make sure everyone had equal access to education. Even if it meant going against what some states wanted, Project 2025 kind of flips that whole idea on its head.
Which means that where you live really matters now. I mean, it could mean totally different things for your kid's education depending on what state you're in.
Yeah, and that's where the whole school choice thing comes in. That's another huge part of Project 2025. So imagine instead of going to your local public school, you get money to go to any school you want, public, private, charter, or whatever.
I mean, choice sounds great on the surface, right? Who doesn't want more options? But something tells me it's not quite that simple.
You're picking up on something. Well, the idea is to give parents more control. Critics say could actually make inequality even worse. Think about it. If you have the money you can pick and choose, find the quote-unquote best school place. Maybe even pay for extra tutoring or special programs.
But if you're struggling to get by now, you're stuck trying to figure out this really confusing system. And your local public school might have even less funding than before.
Exactly. And then there's the whole debate about the curriculum. This is where things get really interesting with Project 2025, and honestly kind of heated. We're talking about what's actually being taught in schools,
Wow.
especially when it comes to things like race, gender, and American history.
Yeah, and Project 2025 is not backing down from that at all. They're using terms like woke indoctrination. It feels like a direct response to everything that's been going on lately with parents and school boards all over the country.
It totally plays into that tension. And this is where it goes beyond just policy debates and starts to feel a lot more real.
We're talking about like what kids are learning in school, right?
Yeah,
It could change how they see the world, how they understand history, even how they see themselves. And that's a lot of power to have.
it really is. And that's why this whole debate is so intense. People who support Project 2025 say that some schools are pushing a certain agenda. They call it woke indoctrination. Like they're saying kids are being forced to think a certain way.
And then there are the people saying, whoa, hold on. This isn't about indoctrination. It's about teaching history in a way that's more complete, more accurate, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
Exactly. And it gets really complicated because then it becomes about who gets to decide what stories are told in classrooms. Should it be the federal government setting some general guidelines? Or should each state get to decide? Because, every state has its own priorities, its own way of looking at history.
Or is it parents? Because that's a big part of this whole thing too, right? Parental control. Project 2025 really pushes this idea that parents should have the final say in their kids' education.
It's a powerful idea for sure. I mean, who knows a child better than their parents?
Mm.
But then it gets tricky. Even if everyone agrees on that, how do you actually make it work? How do you make it fair for every student?
Well, yeah, because not every parent has the same opportunities, the same access to information. And even with the best intentions, parents can have totally different ideas about what makes a good education.
That's right. And that's where things get really real with Project 2025. It's easy to talk about these big ideas like choice and freedom and local control, but how do you actually create a system that works for everyone? How do you make sure every student benefits?
So let's look at some of the specific arguments for and against Project 2025. Let's start with the people who are for it. One of their big points is that competition is a good thing. They say it makes schools better. When schools have to compete with each other, they have to offer a better learning experience for everyone.
It's like the free market, but for education. Parents get to choose where their kids go to school. So schools have to compete for students, just like businesses compete for customers. And the idea is that this would lead to better results overall.
Okay, but isn't there a chance that it actually ends up making things less equal? Like, what about the kids who are already behind?
That is the big question, isn't it? And this is what the people who are against Project 2025 are really worried about. There's actually research that shows that these school choice programs often end up helping the kids who are already doing well. The kids whose parents are really involved, who have no problem getting to school, who know how to figure out the system.
And meanwhile, you have kids from families that are struggling who might not have those advantages, and they end up in schools that don't have enough resources.
Exactly. And that brings us to the whole issue of funding. Because if the money goes where the student goes, then a lot of public school could end up in a really tough spot.
And that could create this downward spiral, couldn't it? Less funding means fewer resources, teacher quality goes down. And then where does that leave us? It seems like a kid's education would just depend on where they live and how much money their parents make.
It's definitely something to think about. And it's not really something that Project 2025 has a good answer for.
Okay, so we've talked about competition and parental choice. Those seem to be the biggest arguments in favor of Project 2025. What about the other side? What are some of the main arguments against it? We've talked a little bit about equality and funding, but what else should people be thinking about? I think a lot of people would say that education isn't like buying something. It's not like buying a car or a new phone. It's something that's good for everyone in society.
Yeah, it's a public good. Public education is really important for a democracy. It's about helping kids become informed citizens who care about their communities, not just about getting a job.
And that makes this whole thing about local control really interesting. Because on the one hand, shouldn't communities have a say in how their schools are run? But if we just let every state do whatever it wants, then isn't that a problem? What if the quality of a kid's education just depends on where they live?
That's a big concern for a lot of people. We could end up with all these different standards, different things being taught in schools. It could create some real inequality depending on where you live.
And that affects everyone. I mean, think about it. How do we deal with these big problems like climate change or the economy if people have totally different levels of education?
Yeah, it could lead to a lot of division. People wouldn't even be able to agree on the problems, let alone the solutions. And that's why some people say that having the federal government involved is actually really important. They say it's the only way to make sure that every student has a fair chance.
So we've gone over a lot. We've talked about the arguments for and against Project 2025, the good and the bad. But I think the big question is, what does this all mean for you, for the person listening right now?
This isn't just some theoretical debate, Ray. If
Yeah.
you're a parent, this is about your kid's future. It's about trying to figure out this new system and fighting for what you think is best for your kids.
And even if you're not a parent, it still matters. It affects your community, your future, the kind of country we're all going to live in. Project 2025 makes us think about what we really care about as a society, what's important for our kids, how do we prepare them for the future, and who gets to decide?
Big questions. And that's why it's so important to pay attention. Don't just ignore it. Read about it, talk about it, and don't be afraid to question things.
That's what this deep dive has been all about. We wanted to give you the information you need to understand what's going on and form your own opinions.
The future of education is something we all have a say in. It's not a spectator sport.
So what do you think? What kind of education system do we want? For our kids, our communities, our future. Think about it, talk about it, and keep the conversation going.